Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her stethoscope as she walked through the sterile corridors of Mercy General Hospital's emergency department, her scrubs bearing the simple identification badge that read Emergency Medicine Resident. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her tired face, evidence of another grueling 18-hour shift in one of Chicago's busiest trauma centers. To her colleagues, she was just another overworked resident trying to survive the brutal initiation of emergency medicine training. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, recently retired from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division and now serving as the hospital's new Director of Emergency Services, barely glanced up from his clipboard as Sarah passed his office. "Chen," he called out with the dismissive tone that had become his trademark since taking the civilian position 3 months ago. "Make sure you stay in your lane during the mass casualty drill tomorrow. We need the real doctors handling the complex trauma cases, not residents who think they know combat medicine from watching television shows." His comment drew snickers from several attending physicians who had gathered for the morning briefing, their expensive suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to Sarah's worn scrubs and practical sneakers. To them, she represented everything wrong with the new generation of medical students, overeager, underexperienced, and dangerously confident in abilities they hadn't yet earned through years of practice. What Lieutenant Colonel Webb didn't know was that in less than 14 hours, Dr. Sarah Chen would be the only person standing between him and certain death when armed militants turned Mercy General into a war zone. The same combat medicine skills he had just mocked would save his life, performed by someone whose Delta Force background remained hidden beneath the sleeve of her scrubs, marked only by a small tattoo that told a story he never bothered to learn. Emergency Department of Mercy General operated with the controlled chaos that characterized major urban hospitals, where life and death decisions were made every few minutes and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. Sarah had chosen this residency specifically because of its reputation for handling the most challenging cases, from gang violence to multi-vehicle accidents to the occasional terrorist threat that kept Chicago's law enforcement agencies on constant alert. Her fellow residents saw her dedication as typical overachiever behavior, the kind of intensity that burned out promising doctors before they completed their training. They noticed how she volunteered for the most dangerous shifts, how she seemed unusually calm during mass casualty events, and how her tactical approach to patient care differed from the standard medical school protocols they had all memorized. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a second-year resident from a prestigious East Coast medical school, often commented on Sarah's unusual background knowledge. "Chen seems to know way too much about ballistic trauma for someone who supposedly went straight from pre-med to medical school," she had mentioned to other residents during their coffee breaks. "And have you noticed how she can identify weapon types just by looking at entrance wounds? That's not exactly standard curriculum at most universities." The observations were accurate, but none of Sarah's colleagues had connected the dots between her specialized knowledge and the carefully concealed elements of her past that she had worked hard to leave behind. Her medical school application had listed her undergraduate degree in biochemistry and a brief mention of prior military service, which most admissions committees interpreted as standard National Guard or reserve duty that many students used to pay for their education. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's transition from military command to hospital administration had been challenging in ways he hadn't anticipated. The hierarchical structure of the armed forces translated poorly to the collaborative environment of modern medicine, where expertise mattered more than rank and where civilian doctors weren't impressed by military credentials that had no bearing on patient care. His appointment as Director of Emergency Services had been controversial from the beginning, with many staff members questioning whether someone whose medical experience consisted primarily of field medicine and combat triage was qualified to oversee a sophisticated urban trauma center. The hospital board had chosen him specifically because of his military background, believing that his leadership experience would bring much-needed discipline to a department known for its chaotic culture and interpersonal conflicts. Webb's management style reflected his infantry background, emphasizing chain of command, standardized procedures, and the kind of rigid hierarchy that had served him well during 3 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He viewed the emergency department as a military unit that needed structure and discipline, failing to understand that medical emergencies required flexibility and collaborative decision-making that couldn't be achieved through authoritarian leadership. His particular disdain for residents like Sarah stemmed from his belief that civilian medical training produced doctors who were academically brilliant but practically useless in real crisis situations. He had seen too many military medical officers who could recite textbook procedures but fell apart when faced with the chaos and pressure of actual combat casualties. The irony of his position was lost on him completely. While he dismissed Sarah's capabilities based on her apparent lack of real-world experience, his own medical knowledge was actually far more limited than hers. His combat medicine training had focused on battlefield stabilization and evacuation procedures, not the complex diagnostic and surgical skills required in a modern emergency department. Sarah's morning rounds took her through the trauma bays, where she encountered the usual mixture of cases that defined urban emergency medicine: drug overdoses from the ongoing opioid crisis, domestic violence victims who wouldn't press charges against their attackers, homeless individuals seeking shelter from Chicago's brutal winter weather, and the occasional gunshot wound that reminded everyone that violence was never far from the surface in America's major cities. Her approach to patient care differed subtly from her colleagues in ways that reflected training they couldn't identify. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested muscle memory developed through repetitive practice under stress. Her situational awareness extended beyond immediate medical concerns to include potential security threats and escape routes, habits that seemed paranoid to other residents, but which Sarah maintained unconsciously. During trauma resuscitations, she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all entrances to the treatment area while simultaneously monitoring patient vital signs and coordinating with nursing staff. Her communication style was precise and direct, using clear, unambiguous language that eliminated confusion during critical moments when miscommunication could cost lives. The other residents attributed her intensity to perfectionism or anxiety about making mistakes, common traits among medical students who were adjusting to the responsibility of patient care. They didn't recognize the signs of someone who had been trained to operate effectively in life-threatening situations, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the chief resident who supervised the emergency medicine program, had noticed Sarah's unusual competence during high-stress situations, but had never questioned its source. Chen has incredible instincts for someone so early in her training, he had noted in her evaluation reports. She seems to anticipate complications before they occur and responds to emergencies with a level of composure that typically takes years to develop. His observations were accurate but incomplete. Sarah's ability to predict and respond to medical emergencies came from extensive experience with combat casualties, where the stakes were even higher and the resources were far more limited than anything encountered in a well-equipped American hospital. The subtle signs of her military background were visible to anyone who knew what to look for, but in the civilian medical environment, they were easily dismissed as quirks of personality or evidence of exceptional dedication to her studies. Her habit of scanning rooms for threats, her precise communication style, and her calm response to chaos were all interpreted through the lens of civilian experience rather than recognized as indicators of specialized training. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's morning briefing covered the standard administrative issues that characterized hospital management: budget constraints, staffing shortages, new regulatory requirements, and the upcoming accreditation review that would determine whether Mercy General maintained its trauma center designation. His military approach to problem solving emphasized standardized procedures and clear lines of authority, concepts that worked well in theory but often broke down when confronted with the unpredictable nature of medical emergencies. The mass casualty drill scheduled for the following day represented his attempt to impose military-style preparedness on the emergency department, with detailed scenarios and predetermined responses that reflected his combat experience rather than the realities of civilian medical practice. He had designed the exercise based on his memories of treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals, failing to understand that urban trauma centers faced different challenges that required different solutions. His dismissive attitude toward residents, like Sarah, reflected his broader skepticism about civilian medical training, which he viewed as too theoretical and insufficiently practical for real emergency situations. He believed that his combat experience gave him superior judgment about medical priorities and resource allocation, not realizing that his background had actually prepared him for a much narrower range of scenarios than those encountered in a major urban hospital. The morning shift change brought fresh personnel into the emergency department, including several nurses who had worked with Sarah during previous rotations and had developed respect for her clinical skills and leadership abilities. They noticed how other doctors seemed to defer to her judgment during complex cases, despite her junior status, and how her presence had a calming effect on patients who were frightened or in pain. Nurse Patricia Thompson, a 20-year veteran of emergency medicine, had worked with hundreds of residents during her career and recognized something different about Sarah's approach to patient care. "She moves like someone who's been in real firefights," Thompson had confided to her supervisor. "Not the figurative kind we deal with here, but the actual shooting kind. There's a watchfulness about her that you don't develop in medical school." The observation was perceptive, but Thompson hadn't pursued the implications of her insight. Like most civilian medical personnel, she lacked the frame of reference to fully understand what Sarah's behavior patterns indicated about her background and training. As Sarah prepared for what she expected to be another routine shift, she unconsciously adjusted the sleeve of her scrub top to ensure that the small tattoo on her left forearm remained concealed. The image was simple but unmistakable to anyone familiar with military special operations: a stylized dagger surrounded by wings, the insignia of the Army's most elite combat unit. The tattoo represented 3 years of her life that she had worked hard to leave behind, a period when she had operated in places that didn't officially exist and had done things that weren't recorded in any military records accessible to civilian employers. Her transition from Delta Force operator to medical student had been deliberate and carefully planned, representing her attempt to use the skills she had developed in the service of saving lives, rather than taking them, the decision to conceal. Her military background wasn't driven by shame or regret, but by practical considerations about how her civilian colleagues would react to learning about her previous career. She had discovered during medical school that her combat experience made other students uncomfortable, leading to questions about her motivations and assumptions about her psychological state that interfered with her ability to focus on her medical training. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's comment about residents who thought they knew combat medicine from television shows had stung more than Sarah allowed herself to show. The irony of being lectured about combat medicine by someone whose military medical experience was limited to basic field training was almost too much to bear, but she had learned to maintain her composure in situations where revealing her true background would create more problems than it solved. The emergency department continued its normal operations as Sarah began her shift, treating the steady stream of patients that characterized Chicago's urban medical challenges. She moved through her assigned cases with the efficiency and competence that had earned her positive evaluations from attending physicians, maintaining the careful balance between demonstrating her capabilities and avoiding the kind of attention That might lead to uncomfortable questions about her background. What none of her colleagues realized was that Sarah's medical training represented only the most recent chapter in a career that had already taken her to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, where she had learned to make life and death decisions under conditions that made the emergency department seem calm and predictable by comparison. The skills that would soon prove crucial for everyone's survival lay dormant beneath her professional exterior, waiting for circumstances that would require her to reveal capabilities that nobody suspected she possessed. Mercy General Hospital stood like a fortress of glass and steel in Chicago's South Side, its 23 floors housing one of the Midwest's most advanced trauma centers. The building's imposing presence dominated the surrounding neighborhood, where urban decay mixed with gentrification efforts in an uneasy balance that reflected the city's broader struggles with inequality and violence. Emergency vehicles arrived at the trauma bay entrance every few minutes, their sirens creating a constant soundtrack that hospital staff had learned to tune out as background noise. The emergency department processed over 120,000 patients annually, making it the third busiest trauma center in Illinois and a critical component of Chicago's emergency medical infrastructure. During peak hours, the department operated at maximum capacity, with every treatment bay occupied and patients lined up in hallways waiting for available beds. The controlled chaos that characterized daily operations required precise coordination between dozens of medical professionals, from attending physicians to support staff, all working under constant pressure to save lives while managing limited resources. Chicago's reputation as one of America's most violent cities meant that Mercy General's emergency department saw trauma cases that would challenge even the most experienced medical teams. Gang violence, domestic disputes, and random street crime generated a steady stream of gunshot wounds, stabbings, and assault victims who arrived at the hospital fighting for their lives. The medical staff had developed expertise in treating ballistic trauma that rivaled military hospitals, gaining experience that most civilian doctors never encountered during their entire careers. The hospital's location in the South Side placed it at the epicenter of Chicago's crime statistics, where poverty, drugs, and territorial disputes created conditions that generated emergency medical cases around the clock. Ambulances arrived from a 20-square-mile area that included some of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods, bringing patients who had been caught in crossfire, targeted in retaliations, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. When violence erupted, federal funding for urban trauma centers had been steadily declining over the past decade, forcing hospitals like Mercy General to operate with reduced staffing and outdated equipment while handling increasing patient loads. The financial pressures created an environment where administrators constantly balanced life-saving medical care against budget constraints, making decisions that affected patient outcomes based on economic rather than purely medical considerations. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's appointment as Director of Emergency Services represented the hospital board's attempt to address these challenges through military-style efficiency and discipline. Board members believed that his combat leadership experience would translate into improved departmental performance, reduced costs, and better coordination during mass casualty events that periodically overwhelmed the hospital's capacity. Emergency department's physical layout reflected its dual role as both medical facility and potential target for violence. Security cameras monitored every entrance and corridor, while metal detectors and armed guards screened visitors who might be carrying weapons into the hospital. The trauma bays were designed with reinforced walls and secure entrances that could be locked down if dangerous individuals attempted to follow their victims into treatment areas. Staff training included regular active shooter drills and protocols for dealing with gang members who might seek revenge against rivals being treated. In the hospital, the intersection of medical care and urban violence created unique challenges that required emergency personnel to maintain situational awareness beyond purely medical concerns. watching for signs of escalating conflicts that could endanger patients. And staff. The hospital's relationship with local law enforcement was complex and sometimes adversarial, as police officers often viewed medical staff as obstacles to criminal investigations, while doctors prioritized patient care over evidence. Preservation. Emergency department personnel were required to report gunshot wounds and suspected criminal activity, but they also maintained professional obligations to protect patient privacy and provide care, regardless of circumstances. Chicago's emergency medical services system relied heavily on Mercy General's trauma capabilities, with ambulance crews throughout the South Side, knowing that the hospital could handle the most severe cases that other facilities might not be equipped to treat. The paramedics who worked these dangerous neighborhoods had developed relationships with emergency department staff based on mutual respect and shared understanding of the challenges they faced together. The mass casualty drill that Lieutenant Colonel Webb had scheduled for the following day represented his vision of how the hospital should respond to large-scale emergencies, drawing on his military experience with battlefield medicine and evacuation procedures. His planning assumed that civilian medical emergencies would follow predictable patterns similar to combat casualties, failing to account for the different dynamics of urban trauma situations. Webb's drill scenario involved a simulated terrorist attack at a nearby shopping center, with multiple casualties arriving simultaneously at the emergency department. His response plan emphasized triage procedures, resource allocation, and command structure that reflected military medical protocols, rather than civilian emergency medicine best practices. The exercise was designed to test the staff's ability to follow predetermined procedures under stress, with success measured by adherence to established protocols rather than adaptive problem solving. The hospital's nursing staff had mixed reactions to Webb's leadership style, with some appreciating the clear structure and defined responsibilities, while others resented the authoritarian approach that seemed to ignore their professional expertise and experience. Senior nurses who had worked in the emergency department for decades found themselves being lectured about emergency procedures by someone whose civilian medical experience was limited to his brief tenure as administrator. Patient care statistics at Mercy General reflected both the hospital's capabilities and the challenges it faced in serving one of Chicago's most underserved populations. The emergency department's mortality rates were actually better than national averages for similar urban trauma centers, despite handling a higher percentage of severe cases and operating with fewer resources than comparable facilities in wealthier areas. The hospital's reputation within Chicago's medical community was generally positive, with other institutions recognizing Mercy General as a place where young doctors could gain invaluable experience treating complex trauma cases under the supervision of attending physicians who had developed expertise through years of handling the most challenging cases. Medical students and residents often requested rotations at Mercy General specifically because of the learning opportunities provided by its high-acuity patient population. Federal agencies maintained a quiet but significant presence in Chicago, monitoring potential terrorist threats and criminal organizations that could target major infrastructure like hospitals. Intelligence reports indicated that several domestic and international groups had identified medical facilities as potential targets for attacks designed to maximize psychological impact while overwhelming emergency response capabilities. Hospitals' emergency preparedness plans included coordination with multiple government agencies, from local police and fire departments to federal counterterrorism units that could respond to incidents involving weapons of mass destruction or coordinated attacks on civilian targets. These plans existed largely on paper, with most hospital staff having little awareness of the broader security considerations that surrounded their daily work. Mercy General's medical residents represented diverse backgrounds and motivations, from idealistic recent graduates who wanted to serve underserved communities to ambitious future specialists who viewed the emergency department as a stepping stone to more prestigious positions. The intense workload and emotional demands of emergency medicine created bonds between residents while also generating conflicts over resources, recognition, and advancement opportunities. The hospital's location made it a frequent destination for patients whose injuries were connected to ongoing federal investigations into organized crime, terrorism, and gang activity. FBI agents and other law enforcement personnel regularly visited the emergency department, conducting interviews with victims and witnesses while attempting to gather intelligence about criminal activities that generated the trauma cases treated by the medical staff. Chicago's winter weather added another layer of complexity to emergency medical operations, with ice storms, blizzards, and extreme cold creating hazardous conditions that increased accident rates while simultaneously making it more difficult for ambulances to reach patients and transport them to the hospital. The emergency department's patient volume typically increased during severe weather events, straining resources at times when external support was least available. The cultural dynamics within the hospital reflected broader tensions in American society, with staff members bringing different perspectives on issues like immigration, racial justice, and economic inequality that were impossible to ignore when treating patients whose injuries were often connected to these larger social problems. Medical professionals were expected to provide care regardless of their personal beliefs, but the political dimensions of their work created undercurrents of tension that occasionally surfaced during staff discuss SIONS. Dr. Sarah Chen's journey to Mercy General's emergency department had begun 8 years earlier in the mountains of Afghanistan, where she served as a combat medic with the Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, known to the public simply as Delta Force. Her selection for the unit had been extraordinary, not just because women were rarely accepted into special operations roles, but because she had demonstrated capabilities that surpassed most male candidates during the grueling assessment and selection process. Her undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Stanford University had been completed while serving in the Army's enlisted ranks, where she had distinguished herself as a medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. The combination of academic excellence and combat performance had caught the attention of Delta Force recruiters, who were looking for operators with advanced medical training, capable of sustaining teams during extended missions behind enemy lines. 3 years Sarah spent with Delta Force had taken her to classified locations across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia, where she had performed combat medicine under conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Her medical kit had been her secondary weapon system, with her primary role being to keep elite operators alive and functional during missions that could last weeks without CONVENTIONAL medical support. Her transition from special operations to medical school had been carefully planned during her final year of military service, when she realized that her true calling lay in using her medical skills to save lives rather than enable combat operations. The discipline and mental toughness that had made her an exceptional Delta Force operator translated perfectly to the demands of medical education, where she had graduated summa cum laude while maintaining the physical fitness standards she had learned in the military. The small tattoo concealed beneath her scrub sleeve represented more than military service. It marked her as one of fewer than 50 women who had ever been accepted into Delta Force's operational ranks. The selection process had involved psychological evaluations, physical challenges, and tactical assessments that eliminated over 90% of candidates, with Sarah being one of only 3 women to complete the program during her recruitment cycle. Her combat medical training had gone far beyond standard military first aid, encompassing advanced surgical procedures, trauma, psychology, and field medicine techniques that were classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. She had learned to perform emergency surgery using improvised instruments, to treat chemical weapons exposure, and to maintain the medical readiness of soldiers whose missions took them into environments where conventional medical evacuation was impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb's military career had followed a more conventional path through the Army's infantry ranks, where he had served with distinction but without the specialized training that characterized elite units like Delta Force. His 3 combat deployments had been with line infantry units that operated from established forward operating bases, where medical support was readily available and casualties could be evacuated within hours rather than days. Webb's appointment as Director of Emergency Services had been based primarily on his leadership experience and administrative capabilities, rather than his medical expertise, which was limited to the basic combat lifesaver training that all infantry officers received. His understanding of trauma medicine came from observing military medics and doctors working in field hospitals, giving him familiarity with procedures without the hands-on experience necessary to fully appreciate their complexity. His prejudice against civilian medical training stemmed from encounters with military doctors who had struggled to adapt to combat conditions, leading him to believe that academic medical education produced physicians who were intellectually capable but practically unprepared for real emergency situations. This bias prevented him from recognizing that some civilian doctors might actually possess more extensive trauma experience than he did. Webb's management philosophy reflected his infantry background, emphasizing hierarchy, standardized procedures, and centralized decision-making that had served him well in military units where clear command structure was essential for mission success. He failed to understand that emergency medicine required collaborative approaches and adaptive thinking that couldn't be achieved through rigid adherence to predetermined protocols. His personal insecurities about his limited medical knowledge manifested as overcompensation through authoritarian leadership and dismissive attitudes towards subordinates whose expertise he couldn't fully evaluate. The transition from military command to civilian healthcare administration had been more challenging than he anticipated, forcing him to rely on management techniques that were poorly suited to the collaborative environment of modern medicine. Dr. Jennifer Walsh represented the typical background of Mercy General's medical residents, having completed her undergraduate education at an elite East Coast university before attending medical school at Johns Hopkins. Her exposure to trauma medicine had been limited to textbook study and supervised clinical rotations in controlled hospital environments, giving her theoretical knowledge without the practical experience that came from treating casualties under extreme conditions. Walsh's observations about Sarah's unusual expertise reflected her own limitations in understanding what advanced trauma training looked like in practice. Her medical education had followed traditional pathways that emphasized academic achievement and research experience rather than hands-on clinical skills, leaving her unprepared to recognize the signs of someone who had learned medicine under combat conditions. The other emergency department residents came from similarly conventional backgrounds, with most having chosen emergency medicine because of its intellectual challenges and professional prestige rather than from personal experience with trauma situations. Their competence was genuine but narrow, focused on the specific types of cases they had encountered during their medical training, rather than the broader range of scenarios that Sarah had experienced during her military service. Chief Resident Dr. Michael Rodriguez had completed his residency at Mercy General 5 years earlier and had chosen to remain as an attending physician because of his commitment to serving the hospital's underserved patient population. His clinical experience was extensive within the civilian context, but he lacked the frame of reference to fully understand the implications of Sarah's military background and specialized training. Rodriguez's positive evaluations of Sarah's performance reflected his recognition of her clinical competence without fully grasping the source of her exceptional capabilities. His medical training had taught him to evaluate residents based on their knowledge of civilian emergency medicine protocols, not their ability to adapt those skills to extreme circumstances that were outside the normal range of hospital experience. Nurse Patricia Thompson's 20 years of emergency department experience had given her insights into human behavior and medical competence that younger staff members lacked, allowing her to recognize patterns in Sarah's behavior that suggested specialized training. Her observation about Sarah moving like someone who had been in real firefights was more accurate than she realized, but her civilian background prevented her from fully understanding the implications of what she had noticed. The emergency departments attending physicians had developed expertise through years of treating Chicago's most challenging trauma cases, giving them practical knowledge that rivaled military medical training in some areas while remaining limited in others. Their competence was genuine and hard-earned, but it was focused on the specific challenges of urban emergency medicine rather than the broader range of scenarios that military medical training encompassed. Sarah's careful concealment of her military background reflected her understanding of how civilian colleagues would react to learning about her Delta Force service, with reactions ranging from skepticism about her claims to uncomfortable questions about her psychological state and motivations for entering medicine. She had learned during medical school that her combat experience made other students nervous, leading to assumptions about her mental health that interfered with her ability to focus on her medical education. The first indication that something was wrong came during Sarah's routine review of the hospital security briefings, documents that most residents ignored, but which she read carefully due to habits developed during her military service. The latest intelligence summary mentioned increased chatter among domestic terrorist groups regarding potential attacks on medical facilities, with Chicago hospitals specifically mentioned as high-value targets that could generate maximum media coverage while overwhelming emergency response capabilities. Sarah approached Dr. Rodriguez during the morning staff meeting, quietly suggesting that the emergency department should review its lockdown procedures and coordinate with hospital security to verify that all access points were properly monitored. Her concerns were based on pattern recognition skills learned during counter-terrorism operations, where seemingly unrelated pieces of information often revealed emerging threats that required preemptive action. "Chen, you're overthinking this," Rodriguez replied dismissively, barely looking up from his patient charts. "Hospital security handles those issues. Our job is treating patients, not playing amateur intelligence analyst. Focus on your clinical responsibilities instead of worrying about scenarios that exist mainly in Hollywood movies." His response reflected the typical civilian mindset that viewed security threats as abstract possibilities rather than concrete dangers requiring active preparation. Sarah's military background had taught her to take intelligence warnings seriously, but her civilian colleagues lacked the experiential framework to understand why seemingly routine security bulletins might indicate genuine threats. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's reaction was even more dismissive when Sarah attempted to raise her concerns during his daily administrative briefing. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate your interest in security matters, but I've been dealing with real threats for over 20 years, he said with the condescending tone that had become his signature when addressing residents. "These intelligence summaries are mostly bureaucratic paperwork designed to cover legal liability rather than indicate actual dangers. Leave the threat assessment to people with appropriate experience." The irony of his statement was lost on Webb completely. While he dismissed Sarah's concerns based on his conventional military experience, her actual background in special operations had given her exposure to intelligence analysis and threat assessment that far exceeded his infantry training. His confidence in his own judgment prevented him from considering that a resident might possess relevant expertise that he lacked. Sarah's attempts to discuss potential security vulnerabilities were met with similar responses from other senior staff members, who viewed her concerns as evidence of anxiety or perfectionism rather than legitimate professional observations. Dr. Walsh commented to other residents that Sarah seemed paranoid about security issues, attributing her vigilance to stress from the demanding residency program rather than recognizing it as a sign of specialized training. The hospital security director, a former Chicago police detective named Robert Martinez, was more receptive to Sarah's concerns, but lacked the authority to implement significant changes without approval from hospital administration. During a brief conversation in the emergency department, he confided that budget constraints had forced reductions in security staffing while patient volume continued to increase, creating vulnerabilities that concerned him but which administrators dismissed as acceptable risks. "You're the first doctor who's ever asked me about our security protocols," Martinez told Sarah during a quiet moment between patient arrivals. "Most of the medical staff treat security like it's invisible until something goes wrong. But you seem to understand that prevention is better than reaction, which makes me think you've got some background that most doctors don't have." His observation was perceptive, but Sarah deflected his questions about her military service while continuing to gather information about the hospital security arrangements. She learned that the emergency department's lockdown procedures hadn't been updated in over 5 years, that communication systems between security and medical staff were inadequate, and that most personnel had never participated in active threat training beyond basic awareness presentations. Sarah's informal security assessment revealed multiple vulnerabilities that she recognized from her counterterrorism training: unsecured access points that could be exploited by attackers, communication systems that could be easily disrupted, and evacuation procedures that would be ineffective during coordinated attacks. Her attempts to discuss these issues with supervisors were consistently dismissed as unnecessary worry about extremely unlikely scenarios. The pattern of dismissal extended beyond security concerns to Sarah's clinical observations and treatment recommendations, where her unconventional approaches were often questioned by attending physicians who couldn't understand the reasoning behind her decisions. Her tendency to position herself near exits during patient care, her habit of maintaining visual contact with all entrances to treatment areas, and her precise communication style were interpreted as quirks rather than signs of tactical training. Dr. Jennifer Walsh began documenting what she perceived as Sarah's concerning behaviors in informal discussions with other residents, describing her as someone who seemed overly focused on worst-case scenarios and unable to relax during routine clinical work. Walsh's observations were accurate but misinterpreted, reflecting her lack of experience with personnel who had been trained to maintain constant situational awareness in hostile environments. The emergency department's nursing staff had mixed reactions to Sarah's approach to patient care, with some appreciating her thoroughness and attention to detail, while others found her intensity exhausting. Nurse Thompson continued to notice patterns in Sarah's behavior that suggested military training, but her attempts to engage Sarah in conversations about her background were politely deflected with responses that revealed nothing about her actual service history. Sarah's review of the hospital's emergency response plans revealed fundamental weaknesses that reflected civilian assumptions about how crises would unfold, with procedures that assumed normal communication systems would remain functional and that external assistance would be readily available. Her military experience had taught her that real emergencies often involved multiple simultaneous failures that rendered standard protocols useless, requiring adaptive responses that couldn't be predetermined through written procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's mass casualty drill planning proceeded without input from Sarah, despite her attempts to offer suggestions based on her experience with actual combat casualties and emergency medical procedures under extreme conditions. His exercise design reflected textbook scenarios that bore little resemblance to the chaotic reality of mass casualty events, with predetermined responses that would likely fail when confronted with unexpected variables and system failures. Hospitals' coordination with local law enforcement and federal agencies remained largely theoretical, existing primarily in written agreements that had never been tested under realistic conditions. Sarah's inquiries about interagency communication protocols and joint response procedures were met with bureaucratic responses that revealed the superficial nature of emergency preparedness planning. Sarah's growing frustration with the dismissive attitudes of her supervisors was compounded by her professional obligation to focus on her medical training, rather than security concerns that were supposedly outside her area of responsibility. The military mindset that had taught her to prepare for multiple contingencies conflicted with the civilian medical culture that compartmentalized responsibilities and discouraged residents from questioning established procedures. Her attempts to build relationships with hospital security personnel and gather information about potential threats were noticed by several attending physicians, who interpreted her interest in security matters as evidence that she was distracted from her primary medical responsibilities. The perception that she was overstepping professional boundaries began to affect her evaluations, with some supervisors noting concerns about her focus and priorities in ways that could impact her future career prospects. The intelligence warnings that had initially prompted Sarah's concerns continued to escalate, with subsequent briefings mentioning specific references to Chicago medical facilities and increased surveillance of hospital perimeters by unknown individuals. Her pattern recognition skills identified these developments as indicators of active threat planning, but her attempts to communicate these observations to hospital leadership were consistently dismissed as alarmist interpretations of routine security information. The attack began at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday night, when the emergency department was operating with minimal staffing during the typically quiet hours between the evening rush of trauma cases and the pre-dawn surge of medical emergencies. Sarah was completing her documentation from the previous shift when the first explosion shattered the main entrance windows, sending glass fragments cascading across the reception area where two patients had been waiting for non-urgent care. Blast was followed immediately by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire as masked figures in tactical gear stormed through the destroyed entrance, their movements coordinated and purposeful in ways that indicated extensive planning and professional training. The attackers wore body armor and carried military-grade weapons, moving with the precision of individuals who had rehearsed their assault multiple times before executing it. Against the hospital's inadequate defenses, Sarah's Delta Force training kicked in instantly, her body dropping into a defensive posture behind the nurses station while her mind automatically began analyzing the tactical situation. She counted at least 6 attackers based on muzzle flashes and movement patterns, all equipped with suppressed weapons and communication equipment that suggested this was a coordinated assault rather than a random act of violence. The hospital's security response was immediate but completely inadequate for the situation they faced. The 2 guards on duty were armed only with pistols and had received training focused on dealing with individual threats rather than coordinated attacks by multiple armed assailants. Within seconds of the initial breach, both security officers were down, their radio calls for backup cut short by the overwhelming firepower of the attacking force. Lieutenant Colonel Webb emerged from his office at the sound of gunfire, his military instincts compelling him to respond to the threat despite his lack of weapons or tactical equipment. His first glimpse of the attackers revealed the true scope of the crisis. These weren't random criminals or mentally disturbed individuals, but trained operatives conducting a professional assault with specific objectives and coordinated tactics. "Everyone, get down!" Webb shouted, his command voice carrying across the emergency department as medical staff and patients scrambled for cover behind furniture and equipment that would provide little protection against military-grade weapons. His infantry training had prepared him for combat situations, but always as part of an armed unit with communication systems and supporting assets, rather than as a civilian administrator facing professional attackers. The attackers began systematically securing the emergency department, using suppression fire to keep hospital personnel pinned down, while establishing control over key positions that would prevent escape or resistance. Their movements indicated detailed knowledge of the hospital's layout, suggesting extensive surveillance and planning that had preceded the actual assault. Sarah recognized the tactical situation immediately. The attackers were implementing a classic hostage-taking operation designed to control a high-value target while preventing law enforcement response through the threat of mass casualties. Her special operations training had included both offensive and defensive aspects of such operations, giving her insights into the attackers' likely objectives and potential weaknesses. The hospital's communication systems were among the first casualties of the assault, with attackers using electronic jamming equipment to disrupt cell phone signals while cutting landline connections to prevent calls for outside assistance. The sophisticated nature of their equipment confirmed Sarah's assessment that this was a professional operation rather than an improvised attack by amateur terrorists. Webb attempted to take charge of the situation, shouting orders to staff members who were too terrified to respond effectively to his commands. His military leadership experience was relevant to the crisis, but his lack of weapons and tactical equipment left him unable to implement any meaningful resistance against attackers who clearly outgunned and outnumbered the hospital's defenders. Dr. Chen, stay behind cover and help coordinate the medical response to casualties, Webb ordered, not realizing that Sarah's military background far exceeded his own and that her tactical assessment of the situation was more accurate than his. His conventional infantry mindset focused on defensive positions and command structure rather than the unconventional approaches that might be necessary to counter the attackers' advantages. The attackers began separating hostages into different groups, with medical personnel being held separately from patients in a pattern that suggested they had specific plans for how to use their captives to achieve their objectives. Sarah observed their procedures while remaining concealed behind medical equipment, noting details about their weapons, communication methods, and coordination that could be crucial for any rescue attempt. The first casualties among hospital staff occurred when a nurse panicked and attempted to run toward an exit, drawing automatic weapons fire that killed her instantly and wounded 2 other employees who had been seeking the same escape route. The brutal efficiency of the attackers' response demonstrated their willingness to use lethal force to maintain control of the situation. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. Sarah watched as Lieutenant Colonel Webb tried to negotiate with the attackers, identifying himself as the emergency department director and offering to cooperate with their demands in exchange for the safety of patients and staff. His military bearing and command presence had no effect on assailants, who clearly viewed him as just another hostage to be managed, rather than a leader whose authority they needed to respect. The attacker's leader, identifiable by his more sophisticated communication equipment and the deference shown to him by other team members, began issuing demands that revealed their true objectives. They weren't seeking random destruction or terrorist publicity, but were conducting a targeted operation designed to capture specific individuals who were currently being treated in the hospital's secure ward. The secure ward housed patients who were under federal protection due to their involvement in ongoing criminal investigations, including witnesses in terrorism cases and individuals who possessed information about organized crime activities. Sarah realized that the attack was actually a rescue operation designed to extract high-value prisoners while eliminating witnesses who could testify against criminal organizations. Webb's attempts to coordinate resistance among the hospital staff were hampered by his lack of understanding about the attackers' true capabilities and objectives. His conventional military training had prepared him for battlefield situations where the enemy's goals were straightforward, not complex operations that combined hostage-taking with prisoner extraction and witness elimination. The Chicago police Department's initial response was delayed by the attackers, jamming equipment and their systematic destruction of the hospital's communication systems. The first patrol units to arrive at the scene found themselves facing automatic weapons fire from prepared positions, forcing them to establish a perimeter rather than attempt immediate entry into the hospital. Sarah's tactical analysis revealed that the attackers had planned for a lengthy operation rather than a quick strike, bringing enough supplies and equipment to maintain their position for several hours while completing their objectives. The hospital's layout and the presence of patients and medical staff provided them with natural advantages that would make any law enforcement assault extremely difficult and costly. The realization that conventional rescue attempts would likely result in massive casualties among hostages forced Sarah to consider alternatives that drew on her special operations training. Her concealed position and the attackers' focus on controlling obvious threats had allowed her to remain undetected, creating opportunities for action that wouldn't be available to other hospital personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's leadership during the crisis was hampered by his lack of understanding about unconventional warfare and his tendency to rely on hierarchical command structures that were irrelevant in the current situation. His orders to medical staff reflected conventional military thinking rather than the adaptive responses that would be necessary to survive and potentially counter the attackers. Operations. The attackers began executing their extraction plan, moving toward the secure ward while leaving team members positioned to prevent interference from law enforcement or hospital security. Their professional coordination and advanced equipment made it clear that any resistance would need to be equally sophisticated and precisely executed to have any chance of success. Sarah crouched behind the overturned medical cart, her mind racing through tactical calculations that her Delta Force training had ingrained into muscle memory. The attackers had established fire control over the main corridors, but their focus on securing the obvious routes to the secure ward had created blind spots that someone with her specialized training could potentially exploit. Every instinct told her to remain hidden and wait for law enforcement rescue, but her assessment of the situation made it clear that conventional help wouldn't arrive in time to prevent mass casualties. The sound of systematic gunfire from the secure ward indicated that the attackers were executing witnesses and patients who could identify them or testify about the criminal organizations they represented. Each burst of automatic weapons fire meant another life lost, another person who had trusted the hospital to protect them now dead because of institutional failures that Sarah had tried to warn about for months. Lieutenant Colonel Webb was attempting to organize resistance among the surviving staff members, but his conventional military approach was completely inadequate for the situation they faced. His orders assumed that hospital personnel possessed weapons and tactical training that they didn't have, while his positioning recommendations would only make them easier targets for attackers who held overwhelming advantages in firepower and strategic position. Dr. Chen, I need you to help coordinate triage for the wounded, Webb whispered urgently during a brief lull in the gunfire. Your medical training is more important right now than anything else you might be thinking about doing. His command reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of both the tactical situation and Sarah's actual capabilities. Treating her as a typical resident rather than someone whose military background had prepared her for exactly this type of crisis, Sarah's internal conflict intensified as she watched Webb's inadequate leadership get more people killed through poor tactical decisions and misallocation of resources. Her oath as a medical professional required her to preserve life, but her military training told her that the only way to save the remaining hostages was through direct action that would violate Webb's orders and potentially expose her concealed background to survivors who might question her capabilities. The ethical weight of her decision was complicated by the knowledge that revealing her Delta Force training would end her medical career and potentially expose classified information about special operations procedures. The life she had carefully constructed as a civilian physician would be destroyed the moment she demonstrated capabilities that no ordinary resident should possess. But the alternative was watching innocent people die while she maintained her cover identity. Her assessment of the attackers' movement patterns revealed a critical vulnerability in their defensive positions. Their focus on controlling the main corridors had left service passages and maintenance areas inadequately guarded, creating potential routes that could allow flanking maneuvers against their prepared positions. However, exploiting these opportunities would require skills and knowledge that she wasn't supposed to possess, making her actions impossible to explain through conventional medical training. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that law enforcement was establishing a perimeter around the hospital. But Sarah's experience with hostage situations told her that any rescue attempt would take hours to organize and would likely result in massive casualties among the remaining staff and patients. The attackers had chosen their timing and location specifically to maximize their tactical advantages while minimizing the effectiveness of conventional law enforcement responses. Webb's attempt to negotiate with the attackers had failed completely, with their leader making it clear that they intended to eliminate all witnesses regardless of cooperation from hospital administration. The professional nature of their operation meant that leaving survivors who could identify them or testify about their methods was not an acceptable risk, making rescue through negotiation impossible. Sarah watched as 2 more nurses were executed in front of the remaining hostages, their deaths serving as examples to discourage any thoughts of resistance or escape attempts. The attackers' systematic approach to witness elimination indicated that they planned to kill everyone in the emergency department before withdrawing, making immediate action necessary to prevent total massacre. Her military training had prepared her for situations where conventional rules and procedures became obstacles to mission success, where achieving objectives required breaking regulations and exceeding authorized limits of action. The decision to act independently had always been the most difficult aspect of special operations work, requiring operators to take personal responsibility for outcomes that could affect national security and diplomatic relations. The weight of her concealed pistol pressed against her back, a weapon she had carried despite hospital regulations based on her assessment of security vulnerabilities that administration had refused to address. Her decision to arm herself had been based on intelligence indicators that her colleagues had dismissed, but which her counter-terrorism training had taught her to take seriously as signs of imminent threats. Sarah's tactical assessment identified her best opportunity for action during the attackers' next movement toward the secure ward, when their attention would be focused on breaching reinforced doors rather than maintaining surveillance over areas they considered secure. The window for intervention was narrow, requiring precise timing and flawless execution that would leave no room for mistakes or hesitation. Her medical oath to do no harm conflicted directly with the military training that had taught her to eliminate threats through lethal force when necessary to protect innocent lives. The philosophical tension between her 2 professional identities had never been more acute, forcing her to choose between the pacifist ideals of medicine and the warrior mentality that had made her an effective special operations soldier. The realization that she was the only person in the hospital capable of stopping the massacre made her decision inevitable, despite the personal consequences that would follow. Her unique combination of medical knowledge, tactical training, and combat experience created opportunities that no one else could exploit, making an action equivalent to complicity in the deaths of everyone around her. Webb's voice carried desperate authority as he continued trying to organize resistance with resources that didn't exist. His conventional military mindset unable to adapt to the unconventional requirements of their situation. His orders became increasingly irrelevant as the tactical reality made it clear that survival would require methods that exceeded his experience and violated every protocol he understood. Sarah began her mental preparation for combat, accessing psychological conditioning that had been dormant during her civilian medical career but which could be reactivated when circumstances demanded the mindset that had made her an effective Delta Force operator. The transformation from doctor to soldier required abandoning the careful persona she had maintained while embracing capabilities that would expose her true background to anyone who survived to observe her actions. The sound of the attackers preparing to breach the secure ward's reinforced entrance provided the final motivation she needed to act. Her hand moved instinctively toward her concealed weapon as she prepared to reveal skills that would save lives while destroying the civilian identity she had worked years to establish. The moment of decision had arrived, forcing her to choose between personal safety and professional obligation in ways that would define the rest of her life. Sarah's transformation from concealed resident to lethal operator began with a single fluid motion that drew her service pistol from its hidden holster while simultaneously rolling behind a medication dispensing unit that provided tactical cover from multiple angles. Her movements were precise and economical, reflecting thousands of hours of combat training that had become instinctive responses to threat situations, executed with a speed and accuracy that would have been impossible for someone without specialized military conditioning. The first attacker to fall was the one guarding the corridor intersection nearest to her position, eliminated by a single suppressed round to the head that dropped him instantly without alerting his teammates to the new threat in their operational area. Sarah's shot placement was perfect, reflecting marksmanship skills that far exceeded civilian law enforcement training and indicated professional military expertise of the highest caliber. Her movement through the hospital's service corridors utilized knowledge of building layouts and tactical positioning that she had gained through months of careful observation during her residency, combined with infiltration techniques learned during Delta Force training. Each step was calculated to avoid detection while positioning her for optimal engagement angles against targets who had no idea that their supposedly secure perimeter had been compromised. The second attacker discovered his teammate's body and began turning to investigate the threat when Sarah's next shot took him in the center of mass, the impact spinning him around before he collapsed without managing to raise an alarm. Her suppressor and precise timing had kept the elimination silent, allowing her to reduce the attacker's numerical advantage without triggering defensive responses that would compromise her tactical position. Webb's voice could be heard from the main emergency department area, still attempting to coordinate resistance among staff members who lacked the training and equipment necessary to implement his suggestions effectively. His conventional military mindset continued to focus on defensive positions and hierarchical command structure rather than the offensive action that Sarah was executing independently through methods he couldn't have imagined. Sarah's approach to the remaining attackers required navigating through areas of the hospital that she had mapped during her security assessment, using maintenance passages and service elevators that provided concealment while allowing her to bypass the kill zones that the attackers had established in main corridors. Her route planning reflected tactical thinking that integrated building architecture with combat principles in ways that demonstrated advanced special operations training. The third attacker was positioned near the secure ward entrance, focused on breaching procedures while his teammates maintained overwatch positions that had been calculated to prevent conventional assault approaches. Sarah's unconventional route brought her behind his position, where a single knife thrust to the base of his skull eliminated him silently while she appropriated his more sophisticated weapons and communication equipment. Her acquisition of the attacker's radio provided immediate intelligence about their operational plan and remaining force strength, revealing that two more operatives were inside the secure ward, executing witnesses while their leader coordinated the overall operation. From a command position near the main entrance, the professional nature of their communications confirmed her assessment that these were trained military or paramilitary personnel rather than common criminals. Sarah's Delta Force training had included extensive work with foreign weapon systems and communication equipment, allowing her to quickly understand the attackers' radio protocols and gain tactical intelligence about their movements and intentions. Her ability to intercept and interpret their communications provided crucial advantages that would have been unavailable to conventional law enforcement personnel responding to the crisis. The fourth attacker fell to a combination of tactics that demonstrated Sarah's comprehensive combat training, beginning with a flashbang grenade taken from the previous casualty and followed by precision rifle fire that eliminated him before he could recover from the disorienting effects of the explosive device. Her timing and coordination reflected the kind of advanced tactical skills that characterized elite special operations units. Her movement toward the secure ward required crossing open areas where she would be exposed to fire from multiple directions, demanding the kind of tactical movement under fire that had been drilled into her during countless training exercises with Delta Force. Her ability to bound between cover positions while maintaining accurate fire demonstrated physical conditioning and mental discipline that exceeded normal military standards. The fifth attacker was eliminated during Sarah's assault on the secure ward, where she found him in the process of executing patients who had been under federal protection due to their cooperation with criminal investigations. Her intervention saved 3 lives while adding another enemy casualty to her count, but the scene of systematic murder confirmed the attackers' complete disregard for civilian casualties and their professional approach to witness elimination. Sarah's entry into the secure ward revealed the full scope of the attackers' mission, with multiple victims already dead and evidence that they had been systematically eliminating anyone who could provide testimony about their criminal organization's activities. The precision and thoroughness of their execution methods indicated military-grade training and complete commitment to leaving no survivors who could compromise their operational security. The sixth and final attacker was the team leader, whose position near the main entrance had been selected to coordinate the overall operation while maintaining escape routes for extraction once their mission was complete. Sarah's approach required crossing the entire emergency department under hostile observation, using concealment and misdirection techniques that drew on her special operations training in urban warfare and close-quarters combat. Her final engagement with the team leader became a tactical duel between professional operators, with both combatants utilizing advanced combat techniques and sophisticated weapons in a confrontation that tested the limits of their respective training and experience. The leader's surprise at encountering organized resistance quickly turned to recognition that he was facing someone with military expertise comparable to his own. Sarah's victory in the final engagement came through superior positioning and tactical patience, allowing the enemy leader to make the first aggressive move before countering with coordinated fire and movement that exploited momentary vulnerabilities in his defensive posture. Her success reflected not just superior training, but the psychological advantages that came from fighting to protect innocent lives rather than simply completing a criminal mission. The silence that followed the last gunshot was broken by Webb's cautious voice calling out to determine whether the threat had been neutralized, his conventional military instincts telling him to verify that the area was secure before exposing himself or other survivors to potential remaining dangers. His emergence from cover would provide the first opportunity for him to observe Sarah's transformation from medical resident to combat operator. Sarah's tactical gear and weapons, taken from fallen attackers, made her appearance completely different from the unassuming resident who had been dismissed and underestimated by hospital administration. The evidence of her combat effectiveness was undeniable, from the precisely placed enemy casualties to her professional handling of military equipment, that no civilian physician should have been able to operate with such expertise. Lieutenant Colonel Webb emerged from behind the overturned desk where he had taken cover, his eyes widening in disbelief as he surveyed the scene before him. 6 professionally equipped attackers lay dead throughout the emergency department, each eliminated, with precision that indicated military expertise of the highest caliber. Standing among them was Dr. Sarah Chen, no longer the dismissed resident he had lectured about staying in her lane, but a figure transformed into something he struggled to comprehend. Her tactical stance and weapon handling spoke of advanced combat training that exceeded his own military experience, while her calm assessment of the aftermath demonstrated psychological conditioning that came only from extensive exposure to life-and-death situations. The small tattoo visible beneath her torn scrub sleeve caught his attention, and recognition dawned as he identified the distinctive insignia of Delta Force, the Army's most elite Special Operations Unit. "Jesus Christ, Chen," Webb whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and confusion. "Who the hell are you really?" His question reflected not just curiosity about her background, but a fundamental shift in his understanding of the woman he had dismissed as just another overworked resident trying to survive emergency medicine training through academic preparation rather than real-world experience. Sarah holstered her weapon with practiced efficiency while conducting a tactical assessment of the emergency department to ensure no threats remained active. Her movements remained fluid and controlled despite the physical and psychological demands of sustained combat, demonstrating the kind of professional composure that characterized elite military operators even after intense combat operations. Staff: Sergeant Sarah Chen, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. "Retired," she replied formally, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from 3 years of the most dangerous special operations missions in classified locations around the world. Currently Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency medicine resident, though I suspect that's about to change significantly. The sound of approach in tactical teams indicated that law enforcement had finally organized their response to the crisis. But Sarah's independent action had already eliminated the threat and saved the lives of everyone who had survived the initial assault. Her success in neutralizing a professional military team single-handedly would require explanations that would inevitably expose her concealed background and specialized training. Webb's expression shifted from confusion to profound respect as the implications of her revelation settled in his mind. The woman he had dismissed as too weak for real emergency medicine had just demonstrated combat capabilities that surpassed his own military training, saving his life and the lives of everyone else in the hospital through actions that required skills he didn't possess. "The security vulnerabilities I tried to warn you about," Sarah continued while checking on wounded staff members with the same professional efficiency she had applied to eliminating threats. "The intelligence reports you dismissed as bureaucratic paperwork. The tactical suggestions you said came from watching too much television. All of it was based on experience you never bothered to ask about." Dr. Rodriguez appeared from the supply closet where he had been hiding with 2 nurses, his face pale from witnessing combat that exceeded anything in his civilian medical experience. His observation of Sarah's transformation from resident to elite operator challenged every assumption he had made about her background and capabilities during the months she had worked under his supervision. "Dr. Chen saved everyone," he said to Webb, his voice carrying newfound respect for someone whose true qualifications he was only beginning to understand. "While we were hiding and hoping for rescue, she eliminated 6 armed attackers who were systematically executing witnesses and patients. Her actions prevented a massacre that would have killed dozens of innocent people." The arriving SWAT team found a situation completely different from the active hostage crisis they had prepared to resolve, with the threat already neutralized by someone whose capabilities exceeded their own tactical training. The precision of the enemy casualties and the professional nature of their elimination indicated military expertise that raised immediate questions about Sarah's background and authorization for the actions she had taken. FBI agents and federal investigators arrived within hours, beginning interviews with survivors that would inevitably focus on Sarah's unexplained combat capabilities and her access to classified special operations training. Her decision to act independently had saved lives but would also trigger security reviews and background investigations that could compromise ongoing classified operations and personnel. Hospital administration faced a complex situation where their emergency department had been saved by someone whose true qualifications they had never known existed, while her actions raised liability questions and regulatory concerns about employing personnel with undisclosed military backgrounds. The woman they had nearly lost due to budget cuts and staffing reductions had proven to be their most valuable asset during the crisis. Webb's formal report to hospital leadership acknowledged that Sarah's warnings about security vulnerabilities had been accurate and that her tactical recommendations could have prevented the successful initial assault if they had been implemented. His admission of error was both personal and professional, recognizing that his dismissive attitude had nearly resulted in catastrophic consequences. The media attention that followed the incident focused on the mysterious resident who had single-handedly eliminated a professional terrorist team, but hospital administration worked with federal agencies to limit disclosure of classified information about Sarah's military background. Her story became legendary among emergency medicine personnel, while the specific details of her special operations service remained protected. Sarah's transition back to civilian medicine was complicated by the exposure of capabilities that she had worked years to conceal, but her heroic actions during the crisis had earned her recognition that transcended traditional career limitations. Medical institutions throughout the country began recruiting her for positions that could utilize both her clinical expertise and her unique understanding of emergency response procedures. Webb's management philosophy underwent fundamental changes as he recognized the value of diverse backgrounds and the danger of making assumptions about personnel based on conventional qualifications alone. His new approach emphasized identifying and utilizing hidden talents, rather than dismissing contributions that didn't fit traditional patterns of expertise. The hospital's emergency preparedness procedures were completely revised based on Sarah's recommendations, incorporating security measures and tactical considerations that reflected real-world threats rather than theoretical scenarios. Her influence extended beyond immediate policy changes to fundamental shifts in how civilian medical facilities approached the intersection of healthcare delivery and security concerns. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a congressional committee investigating domestic terrorism threats to medical facilities, wearing the uniform of a newly commissioned major in the Army Reserve's Special Operations Medical Command. Her testimony about the vulnerabilities of civilian hospitals and the posthumo need for enhanced security coordination between military and civilian medical personnel influenced national policy regarding healthcare facility protection. Webb introduced her to the committee as the finest combat medic and emergency physician I've ever had the privilege to serve with. His words carrying the weight of someone who had learned to recognize excellence regardless of its packaging. His transformation from dismissive superior to respectful colleague reflected broader changes in how military and civilian medical communities evaluated talent and expertise. The emergency department at Mercy General became a model for integration of military medical personnel into civilian healthcare systems, with Sarah's program training other veteran medical professionals to contribute their specialized skills while transitioning to civilian careers. Her legacy extended far beyond the single night when she had saved dozens of lives through actions that revealed capabilities nobody had suspected she possessed. 3 years after the attack at Mercy General, Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the National Emergency Medicine Conference in Las Vegas, addressing an audience of over 2,000 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical personnel from across the United States. Her presentation on integrating military medical expertise into civilian healthcare systems had drawn the largest attendance in the conference's history, with medical professionals eager to learn from someone whose unique background had revolutionized emergency medicine protocols. The transformation in how the medical community viewed military veterans had been profound and widespread, extending far beyond Sarah's individual story to encompass systematic changes in recruitment, training, and utilization of personnel with specialized backgrounds. Medical schools across the country had established new pathways for military medical personnel to transition into civilian practice, recognizing that combat experience provided clinical skills that couldn't be replicated through traditional academic training. Lieutenant Colonel Webb, now promoted to full colonel and serving as the Director of Military-Civilian Medical Integration for the Department of Veterans Affairs, sat in the front row of the auditorium. His career had been revitalized by his advocacy for programs that identified and utilized hidden talents among healthcare personnel, transforming him from a conventional military administrator into a visionary leader who understood the value of diverse backgrounds in medical practice. The Mercy General incident had become a case study taught in medical schools, military academies, and law enforcement training programs, illustrating how assumptions about personnel capabilities could create dangerous vulnerabilities while overlooking valuable resources. Sarah's story was used to demonstrate the importance of thorough background assessment and the dangers of dismissing contributions based on superficial characteristics or conventional expectations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now completing her chief residency at Johns Hopkins, had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates within the civilian medical community. Her initial skepticism about Sarah's unconventional knowledge had evolved into deep respect for the value that military medical personnel brought to civilian healthcare, leading her to establish mentorship programs that helped other veterans navigate the transition from military to civilian medical practice. The changes at Mercy General had extended far beyond individual personnel policies to encompass comprehensive reforms in emergency preparedness, security protocols, and staff training that reflected real-world threats rather than theoretical scenarios. The hospital had become a model for other medical institutions, seeking to improve their capabilities for handling complex emergencies that required both medical expertise and tactical thinking. Sarah's influence on emergency medicine extended to research and publication, with her papers on combat trauma management, tactical medicine, and crisis leadership becoming required reading for emergency medicine residents throughout the country. Her unique perspective on the intersection of military and civilian medical practice had opened new fields of study that bridged traditional academic boundaries. The federal government had established the Chen protocol, named in her honor, which provided guidelines for identifying and utilizing military medical personnel within civilian healthcare systems. The protocol included procedures for security clearance verification, skills assessment, and integration training that ensured veterans could contribute their specialized knowledge while maintaining operational security requirements. Hospital administrators throughout Chicago had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of underestimating personnel based on incomplete information about their backgrounds and capabilities. The incident at Mercy General had forced a broader examination of hiring practices, staff development programs, and emergency response procedures that revealed systemic weaknesses in how medical institutions evaluated and utilized human resources. Sarah's military awards and decorations, previously concealed to maintain her civilian identity, were now displayed prominently in her office at the University of Chicago Medical Center, where she served as Director of Emergency Medicine Research and Military Medical Integration. The Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Medical Badge told a story of service and sacrifice that inspired other veterans to pursue careers in civilian medicine. The tactical medicine program that Sarah had developed at Mercy General had been adopted by hospitals throughout the Midwest, training civilian medical personnel in techniques that had previously been restricted to military medical units. Her curriculum included modules on treating casualties under fire, operating in degraded environments, and maintaining medical effectiveness during security emergencies that civilian hospitals increasingly faced. Webb's relationship with Sarah had evolved from dismissive superior to trusted colleague and friend, with their professional collaboration becoming a model for how military and civilian medical leaders could work together effectively. His willingness to acknowledge his errors and learn from someone he had initially underestimated had earned him respect throughout both military and civilian medical communities. The emergency department at Mercy General had been renamed the Chen Emergency Medicine Center, recognizing her contributions not just during the crisis, but in the years of improved patient care that followed. Her recommendations for enhanced security, staff training, and operational procedures. The facility had become a destination for medical professionals seeking training in high-acuity emergency medicine with military-grade tactical components. Sarah's speaking engagements took her to military bases, medical schools, and healthcare conferences around the world where she shared insights about leadership under extreme pressure, the value of diverse backgrounds in medical teams, and the importance of recognizing hidden capabilities among personnel who might not fit conventional expectations. Her message resonated with audiences who recognized the universal applicability of her experiences. The book she had written about the intersection of military and civilian medicine, titled Hidden in Plain Sight: Military Medical Excellence in Civilian Healthcare, had become a bestseller among medical professionals and military personnel alike. The work provided detailed analysis of how combat medical training could enhance civilian emergency medicine, while offering practical guidance for integrating veterans into healthcare teams. Patient outcomes at Mercy General had improved dramatically, following the implementation of protocols that Sarah had developed based on her military medical experience, with mortality rates dropping by 30% and patient satisfaction scores reaching the highest levels in the hospital's history. The changes demonstrated that military medical approaches could enhance rather than conflict with civilian patient care standards. Scholarship program that Sarah had established for military veterans pursuing careers in emergency medicine had supported over 200 students during its first 3 years of operation, creating a pipeline of medical professionals who brought unique capabilities to civilian healthcare systems throughout the country. The program included mentorship, financial support, and specialized training that addressed the specific challenges veterans faced during career transitions. International medical organizations had invited Sarah to consult on emergency preparedness and tactical medicine programs in countries facing terrorist threats and civil unrest, spreading her innovations in military-civilian medical integration to healthcare systems around the world. Her influence on global emergency medicine practices reflected the universal applicability of lessons learned from the Mercy General incident. The documentary film about her story, produced by the Department of Veterans Affairs in partnership with medical professional organizations, had been viewed by millions of healthcare workers and had inspired significant increases in military veteran applications to medical schools and nursing programs. The film emphasized themes of hidden potential, professional courage, and the value of diverse backgrounds in medical practice. Webb often reflected on how his initial dismissal of Sarah's capabilities had nearly resulted in catastrophic consequences. Using his experience as a teaching tool for other military and civilian leaders about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of recognizing excellence regardless of its packaging. His transformation from skeptical superior to supportive advocate had become a case study in leadership development and organizational learning. The annual Sarah Chen Award for Excellence in Emergency Medicine, established by the American College of Emergency Physicians, recognized healthcare professionals who demonstrated exceptional courage, innovation, and leadership in emergency medical situations. The award honored individuals who, like Sarah, had used their unique backgrounds and capabilities to advance the field of emergency medicine while serving their communities with distinction. Her legacy continued to grow through the hundreds of medical professionals she had trained, mentored, and inspired, creating a multiplier effect that extended her influence far beyond her individual contributions to emergency medicine. The veterans who followed her path into civilian healthcare carried forward her example of excellence, proving repeatedly that military medical personnel brought invaluable capabilities to civilian medical practice when given opportunities to contribute their specialized knowledge and experience. 5 years after the night that changed everything, Sarah stood in the same emergency department, where she had once been dismissed as just the medic, but now the space bore her name and reflected the revolutionary changes she had brought to emergency medicine. The Chen Emergency Medicine Center hummed with activity as a new generation of residents, many of them military veterans, worked alongside civilian colleagues in an environment that valued diverse backgrounds and hidden expertise. Dr. Marcus Webb, now retired from active duty but serving as the hospital's chief of strategic development, watched from the observation deck as Sarah conducted her weekly training session on tactical medicine. The residents gathered around her included former Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force pararescue specialists, and Marine combat medics, all learning to integrate their military experience with civilian emergency medicine protocols under her guidance. "Remember," Sarah told the group, her voice carrying the authority earned through years of combat and civilian medical experience, "your background isn't something to hide or apologize for. It's a resource that can save lives when properly applied. The question isn't whether you're qualified to be here, it's whether we're smart enough to recognize and utilize what you bring to the table." Among the residents was Dr. James Rodriguez, a former Delta Force medic whose application to medical school had been rejected multiple times before. Sarah's advocacy program helped him gain admission. His story paralleled her own journey from elite operator to civilian physician, but without the need for concealment that had characterized her early medical career. The transformation extended beyond individual success stories to encompass systematic changes in how the medical community identified and developed talent. Medical school admissions committees now actively recruited military veterans, recognizing that combat medical experience provided clinical foundations that enhanced rather than competed with traditional academic training. The stigma that had once surrounded military backgrounds in civilian medicine had been replaced by recognition and respect. Sarah's influence reached into the highest levels of government policy, with her recommendations shaping federal legislation that provided educational benefits, career transition support, and professional development opportunities for military medical personnel entering civilian practice. The program she had designed served as models for similar initiatives in other countries facing challenges with veteran reintegration and healthcare workforce development. The evening shift change brought a familiar rhythm to the emergency department. But the culture was fundamentally different from the one that had existed during Sarah's residency. New personnel were welcomed with comprehensive assessments of their backgrounds and capabilities, ensuring that hidden talents were identified and utilized rather than overlooked or dismissed. The environment valued excellence regardless of its source or packaging. Webb joined Sarah in her office after the training session, their relationship having evolved into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to advancing emergency medicine through innovative approaches to personnel development and tactical preparedness. Their collaboration had produced research, publications, and policy recommendations that influenced medical practice throughout the United States and internationally. "You know," Webb said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I still think about that night sometimes. How different things would have been if I had actually listened to your concerns instead of dismissing them based on my assumptions about who you were and what you knew." Sarah nodded, understanding the broader implications of his reflection. The real tragedy wouldn't have been my hurt feelings or damaged career prospects. It would have been all the lives that could have been saved if we had created systems that recognized and utilized capabilities that people already possessed instead of requiring them to prove themselves through crisis. The conversation was interrupted by an alert on Sarah's communication device, indicating that a mass casualty event was developing at a downtown location. Her response was immediate and automatic, transitioning from reflective conversation to tactical assessment as she began coordinating the emergency department's response to the incoming casualties. Webb watched her transformation with the same sense of awe he had felt 5 years earlier, recognizing that her unique combination of medical expertise and tactical thinking continued to save lives through both direct patient care and the systematic changes she had brought to emergency medicine. Her legacy was measured not just in individual heroic actions, but in the countless lives saved by the programs, policies, and cultural changes she had initiated. As Sarah prepared to receive the first wave of casualties, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from concealed operator to recognized leader in emergency medicine. The tattoo beneath her sleeve no longer represented a secret to be hidden, but a symbol of capabilities that enhanced her effectiveness as a physician and leader. The emergency department mobilized with the precision and efficiency that characterized Sarah's approach to medical practice, combining the best elements of military tactical thinking with civilian medical expertise. The team that responded to the crisis included personnel whose diverse backgrounds and hidden capabilities had been identified and developed through programs that Sarah had created to ensure that no valuable resource remained unused. What incredible transformations have you witnessed when someone's hidden potential was finally recognized? Have you ever found yourself underestimating someone based on their appearance, background, or current role, only to discover they possessed extraordinary capabilities you never imagined? Share your stories in the comments below about times when assumptions were shattered and true excellence was revealed. The most powerful lesson from Sarah's journey isn't just about military service or medical expertise. It's about the dangerous cost of judging people by surface appearances instead of taking time to understand their true capabilities. In our daily lives, we encounter janitors who might be software engineers, servers who could be published authors, and quiet colleagues who might have saved lives in ways we'll never know. If this story inspired you to look beyond assumptions and recognize the hidden potential in people around you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you real stories every week that prove excellence comes in unexpected packages, and that the person you underestimate most might be the one who changes everything. Join our community of viewers who believe in recognizing greatness wherever it's found, and help us spread the message that everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are.